and never come back. You are no longer a part of this family. Forgive me for loving you.
Last. The room fell silent. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply bent down, lifted her small suitcase from the wet stone, and walked into the rain. And not one person inside that glittering mansion knew the truth. Not one of them knew who had truly bought the very house they once told her she did not belong in. None of them knew that she herself had signed the purchase papers for 20 billion. But to understand that rain, you have to understand the woman standing in it. Her name was Zola. And that night, the grand stone mansion on the hill glowed like a giant birthday cake. Every window shone gold. Long black cars lined the drive. Inside, glasses chimed and laughter drifted from room to room like music. The Bellamy family was celebrating. After years of quiet disgrace, after years of pretending they were still untouched by decline, they had finally sold the old family estate, and the money from the sale had rescued them. Loretta Bellamy stood at the top of the great staircase like a queen restored to power. Around her neck were pearls that had belonged to the family for 3 generations. She raised her glass, and the room hushed at once. "To this family," she said, her voice smooth and polished. "To survival. And to the buyer who saved us, whoever they may be." Laughter stirred through the guests. "Little House Holdings," Loretta said with a laugh. "Can you imagine? A company worth more than this whole city, and they call themselves Little House." The guests laughed with her. They lifted their glasses to a name they thought was amusing. Remember that name. It matters. Standing near the tall windows at the edge of the room was Zola, quiet as she had always been. She held a glass she had no intention of drinking from. One hand rested inside the pocket of her coat, her fingers moving slowly over something small and wooden that nobody else could see. She watched her husband's family celebrate. She watched them raise a toast to a stranger, and she said nothing. Who was she to them? A carpenter's daughter. A girl from the poor side of the river who had somehow ended up married to their son. For 6 years, they had looked at her as though she were a stain that would not wash out. And on this night, they hardly seemed to see her at all. Then the front doors opened and Terence walked in. Zola's husband. Tall, handsome, dressed in a suit more expensive than his dignity. But he was not alone. On his arm was a woman in red, Renee, the family's realtor, the woman who had arranged the entire sale. Terence held the door the way a man holds it for someone he wants to impress. His hand rested lightly against the small of Renee's back. He smiled at her. He did not look for his wife. Have you ever watched a marriage die while music still played and everyone kept dancing? Zola slowly set her untouched glass on the windowsill. Loretta was already crossing the room. The old woman moved with the certainty of someone who had waited 6 long years for this exact moment. She stopped in front of Zola and made no effort to lower her voice. "You are not blood," she said. "You never were. This was never your home, and now it belongs to someone else. So there is no reason for you to still be standing here." The nearest guests turned. Phones lifted. Someone began recording. "Loretta," Zola said softly. Just the name, nothing more. "Don't Loretta me," the old woman snapped, curling her lip. "Get out. This house is finally ours again, and we sold it clean. Clean of you." Renee drifted closer. her red dress moving like a slow flame. She looked Zola up and down and smiled the kind of smile that cuts deeper than a slap. "Sweetheart," Renee said, "you don't fit the picture anymore. Truthfully, you never did." Then Zola turned to her husband. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is giving him one last chance to be worthy of the vows he made. "Terence," she said. He stared at the floor. "Just go, Zola. Please, don't make a scene." Don't make a scene. 6 years of marriage, and that was his farewell. Loretta snapped her fingers at one of the staff. Zola's suitcase, already packed, already waiting by the wall because this had all been planned, was carried to the front door and thrown outside. It struck the wet stone and flew open in the rain. Her few clothes spilled across the driveway. Some guests gasped. A few laughed. The phones kept recording. Zola did not beg. She did not break down. She walked to the door with her back straight, stepped out into the rain, knelt on the cold stone, and gathered her things one by one back into the suitcase. Rain soaked her hair, ran down her cheeks, dripped from her chin. Behind her, through the shining glass, the party continued. When she rose, she lifted the suitcase and turned back once, only once, to look at the golden windows and the people laughing inside. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she walked down the long driveway and vanished into the dark. They thought they had thrown away a nobody. They thought they had swept the last bit of unwanted dust from their perfect house. But look closely, my friend, because a quiet woman is not a weak woman. And what none of them knew that night, what not a single one of them could have imagined, was that they had just set in motion the fall of their entire family. But to understand what she carried inside her, you have to understand where she came from. Long before the mansion, long before the marriage, there was a small house on the poor side of the river. 2 rooms, a tin roof that sang whenever it rained. In that little house lived a girl and her father. His name was Ezra, and Ezra built houses. He was a carpenter, the finest in the whole county, though people with money rarely said so aloud. Ezra's hands could turn raw lumber into a doorway that made you feel welcome before you ever crossed it. He built fine homes for fine families, homes with sweeping staircases, tall windows, and porches wide enough for dancing. He built those homes for other people. And every evening, he came back to 2 rented rooms and a leaking roof. Zola grew up watching her father build beautiful places he would never live in. She watched wealthy men shake his hand and forget his name a minute later. She watched him kneel in sawdust, exhausted to the bone, still humming softly as he worked. She never once heard him complain. One night, when she was very small, she asked him, "Daddy, why do we build such big houses for other people while we live in such a little one?" Ezra set down his tools, reached into his apron, and took out something he had been carving for weeks. It was a tiny wooden house, small enough to fit into a child's palm. Each window was carefully shaped. It had a little door, a little roof, a shape that seemed too perfect ever to leak. He placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Baby girl," he said, "a home is not walls. A home is not its size, and it is not its price. A home is the place where no one can ever put you out. And one day, do you hear me? One day, you will have a home like that. A home nobody can ever take from you, no matter what. She kept that little wooden house. She kept it through everything. Through the winter when her father caught a chill while working high on a rich man's roof and never fully recovered. Through the morning she found his tools sitting cold in the shed. Ezra died the same way he had lived, on a ladder, finishing another man's mansion, building beauty for a family that did not even come to his funeral. Zola was 19. She had a box of carpenter's tools, a tiny carved house, and a promise echoing in her ears. And that is the thing about a promise made by a good man. It does not die when he does. It grows. She took her father's trade and turned it into something even he could not have imagined. First, she learned the craft of building. Then, she learned land. Then, she learned money. She was patient. She was quiet. For years, she worked in the shadows and told almost no one. She did not want to be loved for what she owned. All her life, she had seen money turn people into strangers. More than anything, she wanted to be loved for herself. So she stayed hidden. Little House, a soft name for a quiet woman with an empire tucked behind it. And the empire grew the way roots grow, underground and unseen. She bought her first piece of land with the last of her father's savings and more courage than she knew she possessed. She built on it. She sold it. She bought 2 more. She learned very quickly that the men in the glass towers were not wiser than her father. They were simply louder. So she let them talk, and she remained still. While they boasted, she signed. Year after year, deal after deal, she built something vast from a dead man's promise and a pair of hands that refused to quit. She never put her face on any of it. She never put her name in print. She was the most powerful person in rooms where nobody even realized she was present. Yet every night she came home and placed the tiny wooden house on her bedside table. Because the empire was never the goal. The empire was only the tool. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was the one thing her father promised her in that rain-leaking room. A home. A true one. A place where nobody could ever cast her out. That was the hollow place in her heart no amount of success could fill. And that was the hollow place Terence walked right into. Then she met Terence, and for the first time since Ezra died, she allowed herself to hope. Back then he was charming. He made her laugh. He seemed not to care that she came from the poor side of the river, or so she believed. When they married, his family looked down on her, but she told herself love would soften them with time. Before the wedding, she signed a paper they demanded. It said that if the marriage ever ended, she would leave with nothing that belonged to the Bellamys. She signed without hesitation. Why would she care about their money? She had her own. They simply never knew it. And remember that paper. It matters more than anyone imagined. So she kept her secret. She loved her husband. She carried the little wooden house in her pocket wherever she went. She believed she had finally found the home her father promised her. She was wrong, but not in the way you think, because the family she married into was already collapsing from within. And when a family is falling apart, it always looks for someone to blame. The Bellamys were not nearly as wealthy as they pretended. For years they had been surviving on reputation instead of real money. The old family fortune had nearly dried up. The mansion consumed cash, repairs, taxes, staff, the endless expense of appearing rich. And Terence, who had been raised to think of himself as a prince, woke one day to find that his crown was empty. That kind of shame always needs somewhere to land. For Terence, It landed on his wife. She remained calm when he panicked. She stayed steady when he raged. She did not seem frightened by poverty, and somehow that made him resent her instead of loving her. How could she be so peaceful while his world cracked open? What did she know that he did not? The question gnawed at him. Then Renee appeared. She came to sell the mansion, but she stayed to sell Terence a story. She was polished, ambitious, and clever enough to say exactly what he needed to hear. She told him he was meant for better. Better than a quiet wife who dressed plainly and came from nothing. A man like him, she whispered, needed a woman who matched his name. A proper society wife. Someone who could restore what his family had lost. "You married beneath yourself," she told him one evening, her voice sweet as honey. "A man cannot rise with an anchor tied around his neck." And Terence, already drowning in his own humiliation, decided Zola was the anchor. Here is where it becomes especially cruel, because Zola did have a secret, but not the one they imagined. She had been slipping away at night, taking whispered calls behind closed doors, falling silent when Terence entered the room. Some days she disappeared entirely and returned saying only that she had business to handle. To a guilty man searching for an excuse, it looked like only one thing: an affair. Terence never asked for the truth. Do you know why? Because the lie served him better. If she was cheating, then he was the wounded one. If she was unfaithful, then discarding her was not cruelty, it was justice. People will believe almost anything if it lets them go on thinking they are the good one. But those calls were not from a lover. They were from her board, her lawyers, the silent machinery of an empire she had still told no one about. She was managing a fortune from the shadows and then coming home to cook dinner for her husband. And he repaid her by counting her steps and calling it proof. Loretta made everything worse. She had never accepted Zola, not for a single day. To Loretta, the marriage itself was an insult. A carpenter's daughter woven into her bloodline. She wanted the girl gone. And when the chance came to sell the mansion and begin again, she saw her opening. Remove the girl. Do it before the sale closes. Do it neatly. But there was one loose thread in their plan. One thing that made all three of them uneasy. The paper. The prenuptial agreement. What if it somehow gave Zola grounds to claim something? What if she resisted? So they moved fast and dirty. Terence signed documents behind her back. Renee handled the details with a smiling face. Loretta staged the whole thing, the party, the toast, the public humiliation, so the world would witness Zola walking away and believe it had been her choice. They thought they were clever. They had no idea who they were stealing from. And let me tell you what she had built in silence, because you deserve to understand what kind of ground those people were standing on. The quiet empire Zola had raised out of her father's toolbox had become so enormous that she could have bought that entire hill, every mansion on it, every gate, every black car, every driveway, 10 times over, and hardly noticed the cost. To her, the money that rescued the Bellamys was the kind of sum someone might lose between sofa cushions. Pocket change to a woman who owned things most people would never even hear named. And yet, for all that wealth, there was one thing it had never been able to buy her: a family that wanted her. She owned homes on 3 continents and still had no home. Bankers stood when she entered a room, yet her husband would not meet her eyes over dinner. Do you see the cruelty in that? She was worth more than everyone at that party put together, and they had just thrown her clothes into the rain. Money is strange. It can buy walls.
it cannot buy a home. So that night, after the sale, she stood in a cheap motel room across town, still damp from the storm, her suitcase open on a narrow bed. She set the little wooden house on the table by the window, and for the first time in a long while, Zola broke. Not loudly. That was never her way. She sat in the hard chair and stared at the carving her father had made. And something inside her grew very, very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, dangerous quiet. The quiet of a woman who has reached the end of what she is willing to forgive. 6 years. 6 years spent trying to earn love from people who had already chosen not to give it. 6 years spent shrinking herself so they would not feel small standing beside her. She had hidden her whole life to be loved, and they had thrown her out anyway. What had all that hiding bought her? She thought of her father.
She thought of the mornings he came home with splinters in his hands and a smile on his face, after building beauty for people who would never learn his name. And in that little motel room, she understood that she had done exactly the same thing. She had spent 6 years building warmth for a cold family, pouring her soft heart into people who only wanted the walls. She had made herself smaller and smaller, hoping that if she occupied less space, they might finally make room for her in their hearts. And all that shrinking had earned her was a suitcase in the rain. Now she had a choice. She could remain invisible, or she could show them exactly what they had thrown away. She picked up the tiny wooden house and turned it over in her hands, and a strange calm settled over her. The calm of a woman who has finally stopped begging for love from those who never intended to give it. Enough. Enough hiding. Enough shrinking. Enough silence mistaken for weakness. She sat with that silence for hours, and sometime in those hours, something changed. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. She knew the number. She let it ring twice more while she wiped her face with the back of her hand. Then she answered, and when she spoke, her voice was as steady as stone. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Is the board ready?" Another pause. She looked at the small wooden house on the table. "Then proceed with the handover. All of it. Exactly as planned. And schedule the ceremony. I'll attend in person this time." She ended the call. She lifted the carving and held it against her chest. "You see, my friend, a quiet woman is not a weak woman. She is simply deciding how loud the truth is going to become. And in 3 days, at the formal transfer of the very mansion they had thrown her out of, the truth would be louder than any of them could bear." What happened at that ceremony was something not one soul in that family saw coming. The day arrived, cold and bright. By law, when a property like the Bellamy estate changes hands, there is a formal transfer. Deeds are signed, keys are passed. The buyer, or someone representing the buyer, meets the seller face to face. The Bellamys had turned even this into a performance. Of course they had. They invited the press. They invited friends. They arranged flowers and food in the grand hall of the house they were about to lose, as though losing it were some kind of glorious victory. They wanted the world to watch them part with the mansion proudly, richer than ever, saved by a mysterious buyer they had never met. At the long table, they left one empty chair for the buyer's representative, imagining some nameless lawyer from that oddly titled company, Little House Holdings. Loretta wore the pearls again. Terence stood near his mother. Renee stood near Terence in another dress designed to be noticed. They laughed quietly among themselves until the tall doors at the end of the hall swung open, and Zola walked in. She looked nothing like the woman they had pushed into the storm. She wore a long, dark coat, perfectly tailored, quiet and expensive in the way real money always is. Her head was high. Her steps were unhurried and certain. And in one hand, held gently against her side, was the small wooden house. The room turned toward her. Whispers began. Loretta's face sharpened at once. "What is she doing here?" she snapped, lifting a hand toward the staff. "Security! She wasn't invited. Remove her from my—" "Your what?" a voice interrupted. It was Mr. Coleman, the Bellamy's own attorney, the man who had handled their affairs for 20 years. He had risen slowly from his seat, his face pale, looking at Zola as though he were only just beginning to understand what had been in front of him all along. "Mrs. Loretta," he said, his voice trembling just slightly, "you may want to sit down." "I will not sit down in my own house." Coleman swallowed. "It is not your house. It has not been your house since the sale closed. It belongs to the buyer." Then he turned and looked directly at Zola, and he said the words that split the room clean in half. "It belongs to her. Loretta," he said, "she is the principal. Zola is Little House Holdings. Your daughter-in-law is the buyer. She purchased this estate. All of it." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that presses against the chest. Terrence's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he stammered. "She doesn't have... She's nobody. She's a carpenter's..." "Daughter," Zola finished for him, smiling a small, sad smile. "Yes, I am a carpenter's daughter. Go on, Terrence. Say it. You always said it as if it were something shameful." She stepped forward into the center of the great hall, beneath the tall windows her own father might once have built. "Let me help all of you understand," she said, her voice calm, so calm it made the room colder. "Before I married your son, I signed a paper your family demanded. A paper stating that if the marriage ever ended, I would walk away with nothing that belonged to the Bellamys." She let the words settle. "I signed it in a second. I never even hesitated. Do you know why?" She looked around the room, at Loretta, at Renee, at the husband who could not meet her eyes. "Because I never wanted anything you had. I never needed your money. I came into this family with more than this family ever dreamed of. And I hid it because for once in my life, I wanted to be loved by people who didn't know." Then she turned fully toward Terrence. "Everything you sold to save yourselves, you sold to me. Every brick in this house. The same house you threw me out of. The same house your mother declared was finally yours again. It was mine before her toast was finished." Loretta reached for a chair and sat down hard. Suddenly the pearls at her throat looked cheap. But Zola was not done. There was one more truth to be spoken, and this one belonged to the woman in red. Zola slipped a slim folder from inside her coat, set it on the long table, and pushed it down its polished length until it stopped in front of Renee. "You should read that," Zola said softly. "My people already have." Renee opened it. The smile vanished from her face as if it had been knocked off. Inside were figures, transfers, the ugly, quiet proof that Renee had been skimming from the sale. Padding fees, hiding cuts, stealing from the very family she pretended to rescue. She had planned to walk away rich from both ends. And now every bit of it lay there in black and white, exposed by the one woman she had believed powerless. Terrence stared from the folder to Renee. "What is this?" he demanded. "Renee, what did you do?" But Zola lifted one hand, and somehow even then the room obeyed her. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't waste it on each other. It's already finished." She looked at them all then. The mother who cast her out, the husband who would not see her, the woman who wore red to a funeral she did not know she was attending. And then Zola said the words that would echo in that family for the rest of their lives. "You sold your home for a fortune, and you were so proud. You believed money had saved you." Her voice broke only once, barely. "I would have given it to you for free. Every brick of it. For nothing. If just once in 6 years, one of you had looked at me and called me family." No one answered. What was there to say? Zola walked to the great stone fireplace at the head of the hall and placed the small wooden house on the mantel of the home she now owned. She set it down gently, like something sacred. Then she straightened and looked at it. And for a moment she was not a billionaire, not the head of an empire. She was only a little girl in a 2-room house listening to rain and a promise. One day, her father had said, "You will have a home no one can ever put you out of." "I'm home, Daddy," she whispered, so softly no one else heard. Then she turned back to the silent room. "One last time," she said, "a quiet woman is not a weak woman. Remember that. Remember it whenever the world looks at someone plain and decides they must be small." You might think that was the end, the reveal, the reversal. But justice is not only the moment when truth is spoken. Justice is what truth does afterward. And what the truth did to the Bellamy family in the days and weeks that followed was slow, complete, and merciless. Start with Terence. He had built his entire identity on a lie, that he was a man of standing, a man of means, a prince who had merely suffered temporary hardship. The sale of the mansion was meant to restore everything. The mysterious buyer was supposed to place the crown back on his head. But that buyer turned out to be his own wife. And once the marriage was broken and the truth lay bare, he understood something that hollowed him from the inside out. He had never been rich. He had simply married rich. And with his own hands, he had thrown that life into the rain. Everything he had thought was his, the comfort, the security, the windfall he believed would finance his new beginning, had flowed from the woman he betrayed. The status, the safety, the soft landing, all of it came from one source. And now that source looked at him with nothing but pity. He was not a wealthy man who had lost his footing. He was a poor man who had been carried for 6 years by a wife he was too proud to truly see. As for Renee, she was gone almost before the ink on her exposure dried. She had chased money and status, and now she had neither. Once her fraud came to light, her name turned poisonous. No family with property to sell wanted her near their door again. The same doors that once opened for her began closing one by one. And Terence, broke, humiliated, ruined, was suddenly useless to a woman who had only ever loved a balance sheet. She told him so. On her way out, she gave him one final look, and there was no honey left in her voice at all. "You had one task," she said. "Marry up. And somehow you managed to marry down twice." Then she walked away in red and never looked back. And Terence learned the coldest lesson any betrayer learns. The person who helps you betray someone will betray you just as easily. Then there was Loretta. The old woman had worshipped one thing her whole life. Not God, not family, but status. What people thought when they heard the Bellamy name. But status is a cruel god. It gives you nothing real, takes everything, and turns on you the instant you stumble. The video of Zola in the rain spread. So did the story of the handover, the carpenter's daughter who turned out to own it all. The mother-in-law who threw a billionaire into the street without even knowing it. The society Loretta had spent her life trying to impress did not rush to comfort her. At first, they laughed behind their hands. Soon they did not bother hiding it. Invitations stopped coming. The pearls stayed in their box because there was nowhere left to wear them. And here is the strangest mercy in the whole story. Zola did not put Loretta out on the street. She could have. She owned everything now, every remaining property, right down to the small rented house Loretta quietly moved into when pride finally ran out. Zola owned that house too. And she let Loretta keep it. 2 rooms, a tin roof that made a soft sound in the rain. Do you understand? The woman who had thrown a carpenter's daughter out of a mansion ended up living in the same kind of house that carpenter had once raised his child in. Not because Zola wanted revenge, because Zola chose mercy. And somehow that weighed heavier than punishment ever could. Near the end, Terence came to see Zola. He found her standing in the great hall of the mansion where everything had fallen apart. He looked older now, smaller. The charm was gone, and without it, there was not much left. "Zola," he said, "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know who you were." She looked at him for a long time, and when she answered, there was no rage in her voice, only something quieter and sadder. "That was always the problem, Terence. You never wanted to know me, not the real me. You only wanted to know what I could make you look like." She shook her head slowly. "You had all of me for 6 years, and you never once bothered to look." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say that was not years too late. Zola walked past him to the tall doors and opened them herself. She did not throw him out. She did not shout. She simply held the door the way he had once held it for another woman. And she waited. Terence, with no argument left and no one left to blame, walked out of the house that had once been his and into the light alone. She closed the door softly behind him. No slam. A quiet woman never needs to slam a door. So what does a woman do with a mansion full of ghosts? She could have sold it. She could have burned every memory to the ground and walked away forever. No one would have blamed her. But Zola was Ezra's daughter, and Ezra was not a destroyer. Ezra built. So she transformed the house. She kept the tall windows and the broad staircases made by hands like her father's. But she filled the rooms with something they had never held before. Children. The mansion on the hill, that cold monument to a family that loved status more than people, became a home for the children of laborers and working mothers, for the sons and daughters of carpenters, cleaners, and cooks, the people who build beautiful houses and never get to live in them. She called it Ezra's house. At the entrance, inside a small glass case, she placed the little wooden house her father had carved for her when she was a girl. One afternoon, a small boy stood in front of the case and frowned up at it. He tugged at Zola's sleeve. "Miss," he asked, "why is that little wooden house there for everyone to see when you have this whole huge place?" Zola knelt beside him until they were eye level. She looked at the carving and smiled. And inside that smile lived the whole story. "Because my father made it for me when we had almost nothing," she said. "And he taught me something I never forgot. A home is not the walls, baby. It is not how big it is, and it is not how much it costs. She touched the glass softly. A home is the place where nobody can ever make you feel small. That little house taught me that. So it gets the best place in the whole building. The boy thought about that, then nodded in the serious way children do when they decide something is true. Then he ran off to play in the tall, bright rooms where no one would ever put him out. Zola stood and watched him go, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her heart was quiet in the good way. And she did not do it once and stop. She did it again and again. She found other cold houses on other hills, houses built for pride and emptied by it, and opened their doors to the very people who had spent their lives cleaning them. She hired carpenters' sons. She paid maids' daughters to run offices. She built a quiet army out of the people the world had overlooked and handed them keys to rooms their parents had only ever entered through the back. Some nights, when the halls stood empty, she walked through Ezra's house alone. She ran her hand along the banisters and thought of the tired man who taught her that beautiful things are made by unseen hands. She stopped by the glass case near the door, looked at the tiny carving, and said the same two words every time. "Thank you, Daddy." And when the rain came, the house answered with that same soft sound against the roof that she had loved all her life. These were her days now, handing out keys, real keys to real homes for people the world had decided did not matter. Every key she pressed into a tired hand was her father's promise, kept over and over again. A home no one can take from you, no matter what. And that is the whole story. The carpenter's daughter they threw into the rain, the mansion she already owned before they finished laughing, the fortune that could buy anything except the one thing she had longed for most, and the peace she finally found when she stopped waiting for cruel people to love her and began building homes for those who would. So let me leave you with this. Never measure a person by only what they choose to show you. The quiet one in the room, the plain one, the one you are tempted to overlook. That is so often the one carrying the most. Be gentle with quiet souls. You never know whose home you are standing in. Because a quiet woman is not a weak woman. She never was. If Zola's silence touched you tonight, do something for her. Hit the like button so more people can find this story. Subscribe if you still believe kindness always finds its way home in the end. And comment one word, Ezra, if you promise never again to judge a quiet soul too quickly. Then share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. A quiet woman is not a weak woman. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, watch closely.